Welcome to the Truth and Love Podcast with your hosts Kimberly Faith and John Mack. The Truth and Love Podcast seeks to present God's timeless truth through the lens of His remarkable love.
Well, Dad, welcome back to the Truth and Love Podcast. It's been a few weeks since we've gotten to get together and talk, and I'm just beyond excited about the topic today, and you're going to be the star of the show.
Well, it's great to be here. I don't know about the star, but I have some information about the topic.
Yeah, and you really have been and studied and been engaged with the Trail of Tears. I don't know if you would call it, it's not a project, but the history, studying the history and been involved with the Cherokee Nation. Is that right?
I have for over 20 years.
So tell us about that. Tell us about your involvement and how we got here today to talk about this amazing story, Untold Stories of the Trail of Tears, which I love that title. Yeah.
Well, I give PowerPoints, and one of the titles to one of my PowerPoints is From Lines on a Map to Stories That Must Be Told. So that goes back to the origins of how I got involved in this. Is we were developing a bike and pedestrian trail system for Northwest Arkansas. And we came up with the idea of using historic routes to be the main corridor for the trail system. And one of them was the Butterfield Stagecoach, and another was the Trail of Tears, and then Civil War troop movements. So we studied all those lines on a map, and they developed into a trail system for the two counties of Northwest Arkansas, Benton,
which are lovely, wonderful trails.
Benton and Washington County. And we formed a group called the Heritage Trail Partners. And as we explored those different routes, I began to, we first focused on the Butterfield, but I began to read journals about just where the lines on the map were that were revealing that the Trail of Tears used the same road. Actually, they were some of the original users in a tragic way of the road that became the Butterfield.
Interesting.
And it was because it was the main road from St. Louis to Springfield, Missouri to Fort Smith. And the military created that road. Actually, I would say they improved a road because it turns out it was probably an ancient Indian path from, there's mounds in St. Louis, and then the mounds down around Fort Smith, the Oklahoma, the Spiro Mounds.
Interesting.
So it was probably a trade route. And if you look at the geography of it, it is the only way through the two counties where you don't cross our major river systems, the Illinois or the White. So after a flood event, it'd be the only way through. And then the topography, the up and down movement, it's almost the flattest way through the two counties.
Interesting.
So probably the military didn't just, cut a new road through the forest. They used an existing path. But so anyway, so that road was the state road or the military road. In some old maps, it's called the Springfield to Fayetteville Road. So as we discovered, we're looking for the Butterfield route, I came across references in old journals to it being the Trail of Tears. So I got more interested in the Trail of Tears aspect of the story, and then some colleagues of mine got more interested in the Civil War routes and that story, and the Butterfield routes and that story. So that's kind of how it got started, was discovering these lines on a map.
Now, for people who don't know what the Trail of Tears is, just because there may be some people listening who don't even know what that means.
And that was me 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I had just heard of the Trail of Tears, and it was, that the Cherokee and some other tribes were forcefully removed. I had no idea when it happened, how many people were involved. I just heard of the Trail of Tears. So it was just amazing to me as I delved into it. So I started going to conferences and meeting Cherokee friends.
Okay, so Trail of Tears conferences.
Trail of Tears conferences held by the Trail of Tears Association, meeting Cherokee friends who are very interested in telling the story. And I'll just put a little subtitle. The Cherokee really are impressive in that they want to tell this story of tragedy, which we'll go through here. But one of their messages is overcoming adversity. Not being perpetual victims.
Interesting.
But they survived it, they persevered, And they are actually now a thriving nation over in eastern Oklahoma. And according to them and according to the truth, doing quite well, thank you, for the most part.
So what role do you play in the Cherokee Nation or the Trail of Tears currently?
I just started attending these conferences and then became a member of the state chapter, the Arkansas chapter, Trail of Tears. It's just it's kind of like you show up for a meeting and you're on the board.
Right.
And then the next thing you know, you're the vice president because someone left and then became the president. But I was really enjoying it. So learning more and more about it. So I started putting together PowerPoints and teaching here locally at museums and schools and Butterfield Village, any place that wanted to have a PowerPoint. So one of the revealing things was, I'll start with this. One of my kind of aha moments was I was at Pea Ridge National Military Park, and there's a portion of the trail over there just north of Elkhorn Tavern leading up to Missouri, up to Waynesville, where you live.
Right, where we have a Trail of Tears site as well.
So it was this formal ceremony dedicating a panel there, and the Cherokee Nation shows up with the chief of the Cherokee Nation and their the Cherokee Youth Choir.
Oh.
And they're all dressed in Cherokee garb, and it's, young men and ladies, high school age, early college. And so they take over the ceremony. So that, it's the park superintendent. And, and of course you've got all this kind of separation of church and state. How often do you go to a state or a national park and hear a prayer?
Right.
To open any kind of event.
Can't remember anything.
Well, they turn this over to the Cherokee Nation, and the first thing they do is the master of ceremonies. I don't know if it was the chief or the assistant chief, or maybe they had a chaplain. They go up and they said, we're going to start with prayer. So I'm going, this is really going to be interesting.
Now, who were they praying to?
Well, that's why I was my ears perked up. Who, they're praying, and who are they praying to? And it was a very Christian prayer. And then they finished with, in the name of Jesus, amen.
Wow. I bet you didn't expect to.
I did not expect that.
Because, we always hear that the Native Americans have their tribal gods, and,
Then they come in with their, the flag, the honor guard. And they're carrying the American flag and the Cherokee flag. And they have this presentation regarding their military service, and they make it very clear they do not see themselves as perpetual victims.
Interesting.
But that, in fact, the Cherokee Nation at the time, and probably still does, per capita, has the greatest number of military members in the U.S. Armed services of any other Indian nation.
That's interesting.
And they were proud of that. And I thought these are some people that were treated terribly by our nation.
Right.
But they serve with pride. And other tribes do too. The Navajo code talkers and
I wonder what percentage of their tribe has served in the military.
Yeah, but it's the highest per capita of any other Indian nation.
Because less than 1% of our entire nation serves in the military.
Right.
And so I just would be curious to know that. Well, that's
then the Cherokee Youth Choir starts singing. I'm going, well, this is going to be interesting. And they're singing in Cherokee, but it's hymns. The whole program was hymns.
Wow.
Like Amazing Grace, or When the Roll is Called Up Yonder, I'll Be There. Just kind of like hymns we would sing in our country churches, all over, the Bible Belt.
Right.
And then one of their primary messages was we don't want to be considered victims. We're here to kind of honor this ground and dedicate this site, but we do not want to be, we're overcomers.
And this was a site of one of the, where the Trail of Tears went through.
And there was a campground there.
Okay.
So that just really drew me in to the Cherokee Nation. Mm-hmm. They just got my admiration and respect. So I became friends I went up and met people and met the executive director of the Trail of Tears Association and just became good friends with that whole group. And then you go to these conferences and you start hearing more and more of the story. So one of the most revealing things was to go over to a conference in Cherokee, North Carolina, because that's where their tribal origins are. North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee.
Are those the states, the 4 states that were removed from the Trail of Tears? Was that
that was their home country?
Okay.
Yeah, Tennessee, North Carolina, Alabama, and Georgia.
So those were the 4 states that they were removed from and relocated to out west. We'll talk about that later, but those are the 4 states.
Yeah. So basically, we can just kind of jump into the story. So what is that story? So the Trail of Tears, and I always thought it was just a singular event. Mm-hmm. It was actually over several months, and instead of one detachment, one big mass movement, it was 17 different groups.
Okay.
There's about 16,000 Cherokee at the time, and they broke up into 17 detachments of about 1,000 each, 800 to 900.
How did it all start?
So the forced removal of the Cherokee, the timeline is that happened 1837 to 1839. But what's fascinating is this whole story it's such an American story, and so much a part of the greater picture of American history. So I kind of have this PowerPoint. It all started with Andrew Jackson was elected president in 1828, and he campaigned on an Indian removal platform, and that's what he was voted in on. So it goes back a little bit before that, of course, because the Cherokee, this was their homeland, so they'd been there forever. Mm-hmm. And then it is kind of interesting. You think of, we have a date, Plymouth Colony was 1620. There was even Jamestown was a little earlier, but we think of 1620. So this is the 1820s. So the Europeans and the Cherokee had already been interacting for 200 years.
Oh, wow. I hadn't thought about that.
So you just think about that.
Yeah, yeah.
So they had adopted.
They'd been getting along.
They'd been getting along, and actually the Cherokee and the Indians are just resourceful, intelligent people. So they see things like iron pots and rifles and spinning looms, and they're like all about this. Mm-hmm. So the story is the Cherokee were assimilating. They had actually formed their own government. This was just astonishing to me. We went to in Georgia. There's New Echota, Georgia. It's a state park now, but it's one of their ancient capitals. They had they had recreated the buildings. They had the legislative building. There's an executive branch.
Wow.
Judicial. They had a constitution. They had government. They had Sequoia. They had a written language. Mm-hmm. They were publishing a newspaper.
Wow.
That was actually being sent to England. So this is the early 1800s.
Wow. So before the Civil War.
Before the Civil War.
But far after we became a nation and after the initial settlement. That's crazy.
There were missionaries down there, and a lot of the Cherokee, and that's part of this untold story. Mm. A lot of the Cherokee were Christians. And there is kind of this I'm just going to call it a myth, that the only reason that the Cherokee were coming around the mission stations was just to get education, to get the learning. But there's strong evidence, and one of them is that they were actually Christians, born again, saved Christians. Mm.
They had independent passion to serve Christ.
Yeah, one of the I use this in an opening PowerPoint slide is a picture of the Reverend Jesse Bushyhead, was an ordained Baptist preacher.
Wow.
In the 1820s, 1830s, and then was removed he was a detachment leader, but he was an ordained Baptist preacher. He ended up serving when he got here to the Indian Nation in what's now Oklahoma. He was a Supreme Court justice.
Wow.
And he would go, the Cherokee were making the claim that we don't need to be removed. We have assimilated. A lot of us are Christians. Mm-hmm. We're into higher education. We're into farming. The typical Cherokee homestead was about 13 to 15 acres with hogs and a log cabin. And, you couldn't tell the difference. If you go out to one of our state parks, Prairie Grove, and look at the log cabins and the interior, that's what the Cherokee cabin looked like.
Interesting.
So they were, not to say that they weren't keeping their culture.
Right.
And most of them would have kept their, we're still practicing their traditional religions in the 1830s.
And that's not uncommon all across the world.
Yeah.
You have people in Africa who worship God. They worship God, Jesus Christ of the Bible, but they have different traditions.
In fact, that's really interesting because some of the foreign missionary boards that were sending money to the Cherokee missionaries begin to have this argument that, well, there's as big a percentage of the Cherokee are now Christians as in the white population. So why do they need missionary funds?
Right.
They should be supporting themselves.
Right.
Because, maybe 5 or 10% of them are active Christians going to church.
Right.
And so there was actually these letters.
Interesting.
So the missionaries, one being Evan Jones, would say, no, we still, they're just sustenance, living, and we need funding. But so that argument was being made that so many of them were, Christians.
So what was the tip of the spear that started this whole process?
Great question. So, Washington and Jefferson kind of had, after, just to be brutally honest, the Northeast Indians, and I don't know much about them, but they had been kind of wiped out.
Right.
In the, with the colonies and the Indian Wars and all this stuff.
Right.
But these are the Southeast Indians. So the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the, Seminole, they've been kind of more isolated from the Northeast. So they've been left alone more. The mountains of North Carolina.
Right. And I understand, to be clear, and this podcast is about the Trail of Tears, which is primarily about the Cherokee and some other contemporaneous tribes.
Right.
Not about
all the 5 civilized
the Osage or any of the other tribes that there are different stories about.
Yeah. Yeah. So like up in the Northeast, you had, the Mohawks and the
Comanches
well, that was in the plains.
In the plains. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for
But so the Northeast end,
right.
I don't, let's see, is the last of the Mohicans.
Right. Right.
Up in, Maine and, so there were some of them left, but down in North Carolina, there was like large numbers of Cherokee and Seminole. So this is, the Trail of Tears is about those tribes. So they've been assimilating and trading with the whites. So what was the tip of the spear? It was this election of Andrew Jackson, 1828. And in 1828, they discovered gold in northern Georgia.
Which is where the Cherokees lived.
That's where they were. Northern Georgia, kind of eastern North Carolina.
Was this a small pocket of gold?
Actually, western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee. This was a gold rush. A lot of people don't know this. There was a lot of gold. Yeah. It was the first gold rush. They actually had a mint in a town in Georgia, a U.S. mint. There was so much gold. So so western North Carolina, eastern Tennessee, northern Georgia, and then northern Alabama is kind of their homelands. So they discovered gold. And I really like to make this clear. The removal of these Indian tribes, it was not about extermination. Because you and I, we've been to Holocaust museums.
Right.
They were not lining them up and digging trenches and just en masse executing
people.
them.
Yeah.
But they did want them gone. They wanted the gold. They wanted the land. The land in northern Georgia is prime plantation land. So for the most part, the Europeans wanted them gone. And I say for the most part, it wasn't all the whites. And as we flash forward a little bit, this was very controversial to remove the Indians, because a lot of the whites were like, well, one of the reasons is the protests, and let's just dig into that a little bit. Because so in 1828, the state of Georgia, and we have to be blunt, they were really some of the
bad actors.
They wanted the gold, they wanted the plantation land, and they started passing anti-Indian acts. And one of them was, you can't process gold unless you're white.
Wow.
You can't do commerce unless you have a white partner. So you can't be a witness in a trial unless you're white.
Man.
So they were just trying to make it
Impossible. Right.
for the Indians to live there. They wanted them to kind of, quote, voluntarily remove. So then in 1830, May 28th of 1830, the federal government passed the Federal Indian Removal Act. So this is kind of the tip of the spear.
And how did that pass unanimously, or how close of a vote was that?
I'm not sure that, Jackson campaigned on that. What kind of showed the pushback on that was when the Treaty of Neoshoda was signed in 1835, and that was for removal. That was specifically for forced removal, and that had to be ratified by the Senate, and it was only ratified by one vote.
The president's vote, or the vice president's vote?
Could have been the vice president tiebreaker.
And the Treaty of Neoshoda was not, from what I understand from our earlier conversations before we started this podcast, it was not something that was ratified by the majority of the tribes. Is that right?
Yeah. So let's just get our time framework back up. Let's back up a little bit to 1832. So because it fits in. So the state of Georgia passed these anti-Indian acts. And then one of their requirements was you had to have a permit from the state of Georgia to do business.
Any kind of business?
Any kind of business or commerce or activity. So there was a missionary there, Samuel Worcester, that had been invited by the Cherokee Nation and had the permission from the federal government. And he, bless his heart, he said, hey, I'm here, kind of by the blessings of God.
Right.
And the blessings of the federal government and invitation of the Cherokee Nation. I don't need permission from the state of Georgia. So I'm not going to fill out your form. So do you know what the state of Georgia did?
Sued him.
Threw him in jail.
Oh.
They threw him in jail and sentenced him to 4 years of hard labor.
Oh my gosh.
So this became an international or national cause. Like, the Northeast Press and, Ralph Waldo Emerson got involved, and this was outrageous.
Wow.
That the state of Georgia has imprisoned a missionary.
Right.
That was among the Cherokee. So this became like a cause, editorials and protests. And so they actually took this to the Supreme Court. It's Samuel Worcester versus the state of Georgia to let him out.
The United States Supreme Court.
United States Supreme Court. And Jesse Bushyhead went and presented, and friends of the court, the New England, you might say, intellectuals, and were arguing against the state of Georgia. And the Supreme Court actually ruled in favor of Worcester and told the state of Georgia, you need to let him go. Federal law permits him to be there, and you don't have the rights of the state to kick him out.
And so what happened?
So it was a constitutional crisis.
Yeah.
So Andrew Jackson, remember, was president, and he had campaigned on the anti-Indian, the Indian Removal Act. So he refused to enforce the law.
Oh, wow.
So the Supreme Court justice was George Marshall. And there's this famous quote that Jackson said, Marshall made that ruling, let Marshall go enforce it.
Oh, my goodness.
So in other words, he says, I'm not sending federal troops down to tussle with the Georgia state militia.
Wow.
And order them to let Samuel Worcester out.
That is the constitutional crisis.
It is, yeah.
That's crazy.
Jackson refused to obey follow the Supreme Court.
So what happened?
So the state of Georgia wouldn't let him out. So this was kind of led to the Treaty of Neoshoda, because the Cherokee were like, oh my goodness, we followed all the white man's rules.
Right.
We went through the courts. We had friends of the court. We won our case. and the state of Georgia is not cooperating, and Andrew Jackson won't enforce the law. So it was a big letdown, obviously. And they're like, well, maybe we should. And at that point, some of them just went ahead and voluntarily removed to the Indian Territory. They had a place. They had an offer that will give you kind of an acre of land in Indian Territory if you'll move for an acre of land in your home country.
So it wasn't like they were they had a trade straight across. That include their personal property as well?
Well, that's really interesting because there was this semblance of kind of, the U.S. was like, we're going to be fair about this. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, they did this evaluation of, how much property did you have? Did you have improvements? Mm-hmm. And the reason we know a lot about this is because they wrote all this down, kind of like a census.
The federal government did.
Yes, and what they owned is the valuations. And then of course, there was corruption and the bureaucracy. So there was lawsuits. Once the Cherokee were all removed, there was lawsuits for decades that, hey, you never paid us for our iron pot. And I had this, and the other. So we know a lot about that.
Where were these records found?
They were found in the different states, like the courthouses.
Interesting.
Oklahoma courthouses and Tennessee courthouses and just wherever the lawsuits were filed.
Interesting.
So it's really, this information is still being discovered.
Huh.
So after Worcester versus Georgia, so what did Worcester do? He recanted. He said, you know what? And he had a wife and kids.
Oh my.
And it was like, I don't want to spend 4 years in a Georgia prison camp.
Right.
Because, if you can imagine, the conditions were awful. So he said, okay, and he's a hero. Because he could have gone back to, Philadelphia or Boston or whatever. He moved to the Indian Territory.
Oh, wow.
With some Cherokee and started his mission station in Oklahoma.
So he didn't give up.
He didn't give up.
He just got out of Georgia.
He got out of Georgia. He, in a sense, saw the writing on the wall.
Right.
He said, they're going to remove us.
Yeah.
We might as well just go on and get our lands, our crops in, and our churches started. Mm-hmm. So he left. And then, but most of the nation didn't. They stayed there. And they kept arguing. They hoped, actually, that when Jackson left, that they would outweight Jackson. And then the next president was Van Buren. Mm-hmm. They thought maybe Van Buren will have a change of heart. Well, Van Buren didn't. He says, nope, you still have to go. So they sent some delegates down to the U.S. government, sent some delegates down to the Cherokee and found a minority of some leaders of the Cherokee Nation, but not the chiefs, not the principal chief. And they got a group of, I don't know, it was 3 main men, but I don't know, maybe, a few hundred Cherokee agreed to this Treaty of Neoshoda. And it was signed December 29th, 1835, signed by a minority. And then that's the treaty that had to go to the Senate. And it was just ratified by 1 vote.
So the chiefs of the tribes weren't even involved in that treaty?
In fact, a petition was submitted while ratification was going on, the debate. Actually, there's a number here. 15,656 Cherokee signed a petition denouncing this treaty.
Interesting.
And had it delivered to Congress. And they said, this is not the reflection of our people. We did not agree to this treaty. This was these few,
And this was a treaty that provided they had like a time frame to leave. They would get this 1-for-1 trade and with land.
And they had 2 years to voluntarily remove. So that was in May 23rd of 1836. So after 2 years, only 2,000 had removed voluntarily.
Wow.
And so by the spring of 1838, General Winfield Scott was ordered to forcefully remove the Cherokee people. So that's when you have the actual roundup, the Trail of Tears. And, it's correctly said that where did the Trail of Tears start? It started on the front porch of every Cherokee homestead.
Oh, yeah.
Because they came to just round them up.
Wow.
They said, you gather your belongings, and they took them to these camps, these internment camps, and started the process of removal.
Wow.
So on May 24th, 1838, Winfield Scott ordered the federal troops, and this is a key point, the Georgia State Militia to begin the roundup.
So Jackson ordered the Georgia State Militia to participate in this.
This would have been so Jackson would have been out of office by now. So this would have been Martin Van Buren.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's so interesting that they got the Georgia State Militia involved when kind of there was that original hostility there.
Yeah, and that's where I kind of add in, what the untold stories, because I think this is important. Number one of the untold stories is the level of Christianity in the Cherokee Nation in the 1830s was very significant. Not the majority, but very significant. And then these pictures of the Trail of Tears, the Indians being herded along like cattle and bayonets, and that's true, but that was mainly the Georgia State Militia.
Interesting.
Because they were literally moving into those Cherokee homesteads. They wanted them out, and they were moving into the properties.
And how do you know this?
A lot of the federal troops wrote diaries and letters about how awful this was. See, they were they're on assignment.
Right.
In the rough country of North Carolina,
it wasn't personal
Georgia.
for them.
Yeah, they were just there, and some of them we have these eyewitness accounts, and they said this is one of the most awful things we've been asked to do. The federal troops, and we have George Winfield Scott. He said this needs to be done in the most orderly, kind of kind way possible.
Yeah.
It's kind of the U.S. military. They weren't just hooping and hollering. Now, I'm sure there were some U.S. Army bad actors.
Some outliers.
There's
right?
always some outliers.
Yeah.
But it was for the federal troops, because a professor did a whole study of a lot of reports of the U.S. Army. And then the eyewitness accounts were just saying the Georgia State Militia were they were coming in saying, you have an hour to get out of here. We're rounding you up, and very vicious about it.
And then they were just moving into the Native Americans' homes, the Cherokees' homes, and the militia or the people they brought with them, or
sometimes, the Georgia State Militia were clearing the homes, and sometimes them personally or their friends were moving into those cabins.
Wow.
Here's an eyewitness account. This is from Evan Jones. So he was a Baptist missionary. He's a colleague of Jesse Bushyhead. So here's just one of his quotes.
No, was he involved or going along with them in this? Was he a leader?
Oh, this is so fascinating. So Evan Jones was a Welsh, a Baptist missionary, originated from Welsh, but he moved to Philadelphia. He had been living among the Cherokees since like 1820s, maybe 1827.
Oh, okay.
And he was
in the East Coast, on the East
in North Carolina.
In North Carolina, okay.
Around Cherokee, North Carolina.
All right.
So he was living among the Cherokee, and we'll just have to get into this whole, bringing up Evan Jones. His operation was not to bring the Cherokee in and teach them English and just have them, learn the gospel that way. He was the opposite of that. Some of the missionary stations were like that. But we need to learn Cherokee. We need to put the Bible into Cherokee. We need to put songs, our hymns into Cherokee.
So translation.
Yes. So he was like, and then get Cherokee Christians to go out among the Cherokee.
It kind of reminds me of 2 Timothy 2, where Paul says, and these things that you have heard from me among many witnesses, commit these to faithful men who will be able to teach them to others also.
Yes, because Evan Jones, his congregation was mainly Cherokee.
Interesting.
And then they would go out and reach other Cherokee.
So he was discipling.
Jesse Bushyhead was a ordained Baptist preacher.
That's so interesting.
And then other Cherokee were becoming, saved, born again, and becoming preachers.
Right.
And they had this neat title. I don't see this in the Bible, but it was just this title they came up with. I don't know if it was just the Cherokee or just the Baptists at the time. But some of the young men would reach the status or the designation of being an exhorter.
Interesting.
And that means that it was real serious to them, and they wanted to go out to the mission stations, and because it was very rural. They were scattered all over the place. They weren't just in a big city.
Yeah.
And they would go out and teach and exhort and encourage, their congregations.
So it was their discipleship program was kind of geared around their culture and the way their culture was set up. And that was Evan Jones. His MO was different.
His model.
Than go in and change them to be more European.
Right.
He was like, okay, now we're going to use your culture to reach your people.
Right. To reach your people with your
the gospel.
Culture in your language.
Right.
And written material, the Bible in your language.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
so Evan Jones really, he loved the Cherokee people.
So how did he get to be an observer of some of this removal process?
So he was there when the roundup happened.
Oh.
And in fact, those 14,000 some odd signatures. Mm-hmm. In one of the books about Evan Jones, he and Jesse Bushyhead and others, they gathered those signatures because they had their circuit riding routes of preaching stations.
Oh.
So Evan Jones' team of Baptists, Cherokee, gathered a lot of those signatures.
That's so interesting.
Because they had the routes. And then Jesse Bushyhead had the skills to then take this and present it to Congress.
Right. He was a lawyer.
Yeah, he was a lawyer.
Yeah. It's so interesting that, I love that you're calling this the untold stories of the Trail of Tears, because I don't think most people think about Native Americans 200 years ago being educated, skilled, orators, publishers of newspapers.
Right. Exactly.
My understanding is that when they moved to Oklahoma, one of the oldest publication in the state of Oklahoma was actually a Christian Baptist publication from the Cherokees.
Right.
That's amazing.
In fact, one of the oldest continuously operating church in Oklahoma was the church started after the Trail of Tears by Jesse Bushyhead and Evan Jones. It's in Westville. It's the Baptist Mission.
Wow.
It's still there today. You can go to services in it. And it was started
we should go.
in 1838, 1839, right after the we should.
Yeah.
Right after the Trail of
It's
Tears.
not that far from Missouri and Arkansas.
So their love of education,
it's also interesting to me how that this missionary and this preacher, Jesse Bushyhead and Evan Jones, were, because of their Christian principles, spearheaded an effort to bring justice and equity to the Native Americans. Exactly. And it was that culture of Jesus that Jesus laid down of loving your neighbor as yourself. Evan Jones was from Wales. He didn't have to be there fighting the Cherokees battle.
That's so true.
But he was there because he believed that the gospel was what was most important, and he could glorify God through using his position as a, white man to help people who really were kind of at the mercy of a very unjust, unconstitutional federal government and state government.
That's so true. He really is an amazing man. He loved the Cherokee. And then something telling about Evan Jones, just like Samuel Worcester. But see, Samuel Worcester moved early. But Evan Jones stayed and fought the fight against removal.
Right. And both were important. Yeah, obviously.
But he advocated for them to stay there. And then his wife died, children died. This is North Carolina. This is the Smoky Mountains, the tough, rugged terrain.
They died while they were there?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
At his mission station. And so when the Indians were finally removed, he could have gone back to Philadelphia. No, he traveled on the Trail of Tears. Him and Jesse Bushyhead were detachment leaders.
So that's why he's got a diary.
Came on the Trail of Tears.
Wow.
And established, and then he lived and died in Indian Territory.
Wow.
But back to this first-hand account. Here's Evan Jones when they were rounding up the Cherokee. He wrote to his mission board. The work of war in time of peace has commenced in the Georgia part of the Cherokee Nation and was executed in an unfeeling and brutal manner. They were driven before the soldiers through mud and water with whooping and hollowing like droves of cattle. At Ross's Landing, that's Chattanooga, Tennessee, the place to which most of the Georgia Indians were brought, the scenes of distress defy all description. In many instances, they were dragged from their homes without change of clothing and marched 120 or 30 miles through heat and dust and rain and mud, in many cases barefooted, lodged on the hard ground, destitute of shelter from dews and rains. They had, of course, become very dirty, and on that account, they have been reproached as degraded wretches.
Wow. That's powerful.
So not only he's describing what happened, but also he's kind of defending them, saying they've been regarded as degraded wretches because how they looked after this journey.
Right.
But he's saying
it wasn't their doing.
This is how they live.
Yeah. Yeah.
But this is how anybody would look after being dragged along for 100 miles.
You know, it just really, it's such a powerful reminder to me to hear how the tip of the spear, and again, every state, every nation's got things that they're ashamed of, that their people before them have done. And you just think about the amount of greed and pride that it would take to treat another human that way.
Right.
You know? And of course we know Jesus was treated that way.
Right.
But it's like, you get so darkened that you do the most inhumane things because you've been darkened by whatever work of the flesh, you know, or pride, greed, you know, just selfishness.
So that's interesting because here's the other side of that story. Here's one of the federal troops, Lieutenant John Phelps. This is June 22nd, 1838, from Fort Butler, which is in North Carolina. But they're on their way to Ross's Landing, Chattanooga. And he says, this is a report, upwards of 1,000 Indians passed by today from Fort Hembry, 18 miles to the east, where they have been collected. Some had ponies, some had small quantities of luggage, but generally they were unencumbered, having left all behind. When I saw them, men, women, and children, moving along through the valley toward the west, I could not think but some fearful retribution would yet come upon us from this much impugned race. The scene seemed to me more like a distempered dream or something worthy of the Dark Ages.
Wow.
So here's this lieutenant, and he's full of compassion.
Right.
He's like, this is awful how we're treating these people.
Yeah.
And there's just story after story and, recorded journal from the federal officers.
Yeah.
Going like, this is awful. This isn't right.
Well, and you know, something that I know you and I have had very just, here and there conversations about, as you've learned, about the Cherokee and the Trail of Tears. And it seems like we were having a discussion about one of these discussions we've had. And you said something about how the Cherokee would have tent revivals along the way.
This is what amazed me. They would have actually in one of the camps in North Carolina around, I think it's Butler, North Carolina. It was kind of an early collection point before they'd been shipped on to Ross's Landing. But they had revivals, they had camp meetings, they had baptisms.
How do you know this?
And there's these recordings from Army officers.
Wow.
That went down and observed, and they were like in shock. Like, the Cherokee are baptizing people down in the river.
Wow.
And they're having tent revivals and singing.
Yeah.
And some of these Army officers are like, what are we doing? Why aren't we removing these people? Here they're
living out their
more
faith.
Christian, living out their faith than we are.
Right.
They're singing and rejoicing and having, invitations and down in the river being baptized.
Wow.
And here we are rounding them up, keeping them at gunpoint.
And I had never, like when you told me that, I was like, I have never heard these stories. And I was very curious. Of course, that's one reason why I wanted to do this podcast about where was this information coming from? And it turns out it's very well documented. All of it's very well documented. And it's not even in our history books. Many of our history books don't even have this in it.
So one of the detachments was led by Jesse Bushyhead, about 800.
And again, to clarify, when you say detachments, you're talking about groups of Cherokees.
When they had had them in the camps, and they broke them up, like we said earlier, into detachments around 800 to 900.
Right.
And they weren't all together. They came, they came 4 or 5 different routes.
Right.
But we don't have time to get into all that. That's a whole nother story. But it was different routes, different times. Some came by river, some came overland. So Jesse Bushyhead was head of one detachment that came overland through Illinois and Missouri, Waynesville. Jesse Bushyhead would have come right through Waynesville.
Right by my office.
Yeah, down through Pea Ridge. But when they came through Nashville, his detachment were the Baptists. There were about 500 or 600 Baptists.
Wow.
With Jesse Bushyhead. They were invited by the Nashville Baptists to come to a meeting.
Really?
And Jesse Bushyhead preached. So we have a report of this in the Nashville Baptist publication.
Wow.
And they're bragging on the Cherokee and how lovely they are and peaceful and sincere. And that Jesse Bushyhead got up and preached a message about Jesus Christ and sat down in tears. Oh, Jesse Bushyhead.
Wow.
So anybody says, no, they were just faking Christianity to get some education. Jesse Bushyhead preached a message that brought him to tears.
Wow.
And the Nashville Baptists to tears. And they were like, these Cherokee are like our brethren. And this is in a publication of it's the Nashville Baptist Herald or something like that.
Wow.
So
something
very
we can
documented.
Read,
it's
something we can read today that was written back when it happened.
Yeah.
So what happened? What else? What are some of the other untold stories? Or what do you want to tell us next? I should ask.
I think just kind of to sum up, so the idea of removal was to get them all to Ross's Landing, which is Chattanooga, and all go by river. And so again, it was terrible, but the idea was to get it done quickly. And what happened is the Arkansas River was too dry that year, so they could only get to about Little Rock. And but it was horrible. I mean, there were steamboats, but the Cherokee were on flat barges being pulled by the steamboats. So it's not a
What's like
good
they were the
story.
luxury cabin.
Not a luxury.
Right.
It wasn't luxury, but the whole idea was to be quick and efficient. The Arkansas River had kind of dried up. They could not get to Oklahoma, to Fort Gibson, so they got stuck in those camps. And the Cherokee chief, John Ross, petitioned Winfield Scott. He said, "Can we just remove ourselves? We don't need an army escort. We give up. We know we've seen the writing on the wall." So Winfield Scott okayed that and funded it. Not enough, but funded it. But they had to get wagons and supplies, and so they got stuck in those Georgia and Tennessee prison camps over the summer. And it wasn't, my point is, it wasn't intentional.
Right.
To round them up. In fact, there was arguments to let them go back home for the summer and then gather them back up in the fall. But so that was ruled out. So, but some of the worst experiences were in those camps. Think of, if you've seen the movie Andersonville, the Civil War camps in Georgia, just hot, dysentery, the water went bad.
Right.
So that's where a lot of the deaths were in those camps.
I didn't know that either.
So then,
but that wasn't necessarily
and it wasn't planned.
Anybody's fault.
No, it wasn't planned. And then when they finally started, so in late 1838, in the fall, they got on the road and they got hit by one of the worst winters ever.
Wow.
It was so cold the Mississippi River froze up.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So some of the detachments got stuck on the east side of the Mississippi River and had to wait for the ice blocks to melt. So it just became tragedy upon tragedy.
Wow.
So the removal was terrible. But I guess one of the points is it wasn't intended to be as terrible as it was by the feds.
Right.
It was a land grab.
Right.
They wanted them gone.
Right.
But it wasn't like, let's make this as miserable as possible. It turned
yeah.
out that way.
I mean, nobody, and nobody, just to be clear, nobody is excusing what happened. It was wrong. It was just wrong on every level. But I think that, at least from my standpoint, the takeaway to this is anytime we have affliction, it is an opportunity to be greater than you would have been without affliction. And the Cherokee mantra that you've mentioned, we're not victims.
Right.
You know,
we're survivors.
We're survivors.
We're overcomers.
Yeah.
More than just survivors. Yeah.
Even better.
Yeah.
Is, to me, this story, like all of our stories, that of whether something bad somebody else has done to us or something stupid we've done for ourselves, is an opportunity which they are using, and they have been using, to write a greater story.
Right.
You know, and all for God's glory. And because you think about, I mean, I don't know, the more I learn about people like Jesse Bushyhead, you know, how he was a lawyer, he was a preacher, and he had such a short life, but he did so much in that short life. And he, you know, is even being talked about 200 years after his death, you know.
And then here's kind of, you know, a triumphant end, is they came here and they reestablished their schools, reestablished their churches, reestablished their government. And their story is, we want this terrible tragedy told, but they want it told honestly.
Yeah.
They want it, you know, they're the ones that are uncovering that the federal troops weren't as bad as the Georgia State Militia, you know, that it was not the intent to, you know, make it as miserable as possible. But there's plenty of bad stories.
Right.
Like there was funding, but the whites along the way would cheat the Cherokee. They'd gouge them.
Yeah.
They'd charge more for ferry crossings.
Right.
Jack up the price of food.
Right.
You know, so terrible treatment.
Right.
So, but the Cherokee made it to Indian Territory, reestablished their culture. And I'll just have Jesse Bushyhead died in 1844.
So he
died young.
Yeah.
But his gravestone's over in this mission church in Westville, Oklahoma. And here's a picture of Hannah over there at the Baptist mission in our little PowerPoint. But here's from his gravestone. And we would all wish to have this said about us. So it says, "Sacred to the memory of the Reverend Jesse Bushyhead, born in the old Cherokee Nation in East Tennessee, September 1804, died in the present Cherokee Nation, July 17th, 1844. And then this quote, "Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things." Matthew 25:23.
That's a great epithet.
So he was an honored man.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, I love that. There's so many things I love about this story, but just think about Evan Jones, born in Wales, right? He could have just lived in Wales his whole life, you know, but the Lord called him to follow the Great Commission, you know, to go into the uttermost parts of the earth and preach the gospel and make disciples. I mean, when Jesus talks about go ye therefore, the first thing he says is make disciples. Well, that's, to me, and we've got, of course, Brother Robert Creech, who is been a missionary down to Panama. He follows his model. You go into a country and you don't put the white ways and the white men in charge, using that term loosely, but you train the people who were born there to become disciplers. And
that's right. That's the biblical method of discipleship and missions and churches. And that's what Devin Jones was doing.
And as a result, we have in Oklahoma now, isn't that where most of the settlement is, or is it?
They're mostly in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And I would venture to say, I'd like to study this, but I would venture to say that the largest denomination in Oklahoma would be Baptist.
Of the Cherokee.
Of the Cherokee.
Yeah. Well, my point being that because the discipleship was done more from grassroots within the culture, and teaching the people of the culture how to study God's word and carry out the gospel and carry out the Great Commission, then they were, of course, able to reach a much broader spectrum of people, because they were in, the people that their neighbors, their friends who knew that they respected the Cherokee culture would then be able to relate.
Right.
Which I think is what Jesus, was trying to, I think he's trying to tell us that we need to, and I'm just speaking to culture, we need to be the kind of people who meet people where they are and teach them based on where they are and what they know or don't know, and then train them to get their discipleship I don't use the word program, but to learn how to be disciplers based on where they are, not train them to be something else.
Yeah, and think of the Cherokee boldness. Go back to Pea Ridge National Military Park, where you're at a federal park, and you've been introduced by the superintendent.
Right.
And then to start the whole ceremony with a Christian prayer.
Right. That's crazy.
I was just like, the superintendent couldn't do that.
Right.
But he couldn't tell the Cherokee not to.
Well, they're sovereign nation, right?
Exactly. He's not going to say, wait, you can't mention Jesus in a federal park.
Well, you think
so I just thought, these people have it together.
Well, and you think about how God used this terrible, process to give them this sovereignty status, to have the ability to go in and basically unapologetically say, this is who we are and this is what we stand for, and we're going to do this God's way.
And I'll say this, I go to conferences, and some of them are in Tahlequah. I don't think I've been to a conference or an event that's hosted by the Cherokee, and it's a meal that they don't have a prayer.
Interesting.
To begin with.
So the Christian culture,
the strong
biblical culture, has permeated their culture to the extent that it's like we teach in the Bible concepts. We talk about, where does your truth come from? Because ultimately the truth, the source of truth, is going to drive the cultural norm, right? I mean, if the Bible is the source of truth, if the golden rule is the source of truth that the culture most relies upon, that's what's going to be reflected in government, in public meetings, in the public square, in the education system. And the Cherokee, I mean, because of this tragedy, because they were, I'm assuming their sovereignty was something that, and I don't know, maybe you can answer this. What point did the U.S. government recognize the Cherokee as being, or other nations as being sovereign nations that would not be able to be dictated by the states?
That is really fascinating because it's still going on. But of all things, they were, the terrible story goes on. They got here, they were establishing their nation. They had a large amount of sovereignty. In fact, just one fact, I don't know if this is true, but it's been said that in the 1840s and 1850s, and I guess up to the Civil War, that there was more law and order in the Cherokee Nation than in Western Arkansas.
Oh, well.
Because they had, their law and order.
Yeah,
they brought their culture with them, and we were just the Wild West, shoot 'em up,
Right.
Fort Smith, gunfights, and, So they established their culture. Then after the Civil War, they really got a bad deal because an original faction of the Cherokee joined the Confederates. But then most of them joined the Union.
Why would they do that?
But the Confederates joined the Confederates.
Yeah.
Some of the slave owner, and it was I'm going to say the mixed bloods, were slave owners. And from northern Georgia, and they had slaves, so they were pro-slavery.
Wow.
And it's really funny because these Baptists, Evan Jones, they had decreed in North Carolina that slavery was a sin.
Interesting.
The Baptists. And when Evan Jones got over here, he was actually accused by the Fort Smith newspapers of being an abolitionist.
Gosh.
And he wasn't. He was just like, they thought it was a sin, but they weren't for freeing, they weren't advocating freeing the slaves, but they thought it was a sin to own a slave, as the Baptists. And that's before the Civil War, that's what created the Northern and the Southern Baptists. So anyway, after the Civil War, the Union, the Feds took the position that the Cherokee had sided with the Confederates. So they got the full brunt force of Reconstruction.
Oh, wow.
And we're taking over everything, and you have no status whatsoever. So the tribes in general, then the Plains, the Indian Wars, which were, now, if you talk about closer to genocide, that was the Plains Wars after the Civil War. 1870s, 1880s.
I read about those.
It was brutal. That was extermination.
The
intent of extermination, much more than the Cherokee and the Seminole. But it was, surprisingly enough, the sovereignty question, it was President Nixon that passed some kind of order in the 1970s that allowed the Indian nations to reestablish a form of government,
Really?
to have councils and a chief and a greater degree of self-autonomy. And now, if you've been following it, that's growing.
Yes, yes.
And interestingly enough, all these where the Indians are claiming more sovereignty, their cases go back to Worcester versus Georgia.
Interesting.
Because they're telling the states, we have federal treaties.
Yeah.
We have federal agreements, and those trump overrule states.
Absolutely,
laws,
yeah.
Positions.
So
it's fascinating. It's ongoing today.
I had a case in the. It was a person who was injured in a casino in Oklahoma, and it's controlled by the Quapaw Nation.
Yeah.
And so I had to become a member of the bar, the Quapaw Bar Association.
That's fascinating.
Get admitted to their bar in order to file my lawsuit. And I thought it was great and I didn't know this history about how back 200 years before they'd had their own very organized government with kind of three branches of government, really.
Right. Yeah, the Cherokee did.
Yeah.
And
so it's very interesting. But I don't know if there's anything else you want to tell us about this, but the big takeaway I'm getting from this whole podcast, which thank you very much for sharing all your research and knowledge in this, is that the power of the gospel is really permeated this culture and made their story still alive today, even though it was a horrible thing what happened to them, but because of the that you have this whole side or whole facet of people like Evan Jones and Jesse Bushyhead, who put their skills to work for the people,
right,
in the context of the gospel, really. Because if you read, from what I've read about Jesse Bushyhead, he lived for Jesus.
Yeah, and the fruits of those labors are still ongoing today,
Yes.
what they did.
Yes.
Yeah, in the Cherokee Nation.
It's almost like God gave them limitless ability to be remembered in eternity because they lived with their primary purpose being to glorify God and to bring the gospel to a people. And instead of just fighting a war for a nation to survive, it was a deeper eternal purpose,
right?
Which is really incredible.
Yeah, and you go back to on Jesse Bushyhead's gravestone. Well done, good and faithful servant. Thou hast been faithful over a few things. I will make thee ruler over many things.
Okay.
And this was in 1844, and here we are in 2025, reading and studying and contemplating Jesse Bushyhead because he was a servant of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and he
discipled.
And he inspired, he's inspiring me today in 2025, you know, and I just, so I appreciate you sharing these untold stories from the Trail of Tears. I love it. Thanks, Dad.
You're welcome. This has been great.
Yeah, and you all listening, just have a great week, and just makes us understand that even an ordinary person can live an extraordinary life when their life is lived for the glory of God. So glory be to God.
Great. Amen.
You've been listening to the Truth and Love podcast with your hosts, Kimberly Faith and John Mack. To discover more answers to the big questions in life, visit us at gofaithstrong.com.
He rescued me.